Hi there, I'm going to do a quick video recalculating the dates now that we have a new sentencing date for Elizabeth Holmes. And I also thought you might be interested in comparing the possible sentences between Elizabeth Holmes and the possible sentence for Sunny Balwani. So please hit that like button. Please share these videos, hit the bell notification, and please do leave a comment or question because I want to know what your analysis is. All right, so Elizabeth Holmes' sentencing hearing is now scheduled for October 17th. It was September 26th, but now it's continued to October 17th. There's no reason given as to why there's a continuance. Some of you are a bit suspicious. Maybe she's having a baby. Maybe probation needs a little bit more time to interview the victims, the investors, those three investors in the Elizabeth Holmes case that she was convicted of defrauding. The $144 million estimated that she was convicted of defrauding these investors of. So maybe the probation needs additional time. We'll have to wait and see. Okay, so recalculating, when's the pre-sentence report due? So the pre-sentence report from the probation department that's going to go and interview Elizabeth Holmes and also all the investors, figure out what the amount of loss is, talk to anyone else that needs to be having input with the sentencing, talk to both parties, and make the recommendation to the judge. That pre-sentence report is due 35 days before October 17th. So if I did my math right, that would be September 12th. So by September 12th, there should be the pre-sentence report, the recommendation, the sentence recommendation from probation. So 14 days after that, so that would be September 26th, both sides can make their objections to whatever recommendation probation is recommending as far as the sentence. It could be anything from the probation's recommendation is not applying the right sentencing range, or not considering other evidence, or not considering factors in aggravation or in mitigation. And I'll talk to you about those in a second because those are kind of interesting when we compare the possible sentence for Sunny Balwani versus the possible sentence for Elizabeth Holmes. Okay, so let me get to those factors. So there are roughly 3 factors that could increase Elizabeth Holmes' sentence and also Sunny Balwani's. And you can go ahead and take a look at the videos I have done. I did 4 regarding calculating Elizabeth Holmes' possible sentence. I went over 3 ways that the judge could increase, and potentially 4 ways that the judge could reduce her sentence. Okay, so let's take a look at the 3 likely factors. 1, I have to look at my notes, it's Friday. Was she an organizer or a leader in the criminal activity? Organizer or leader? What do you think? If so, that increases her step to 3. And we'll look at the sentencing table in 1 second, so hang on. Did she abuse the trust? So taking in money for investors, could that be argued that's an abuse of trust? If so, that's an additional 2 steps. 3rd factor, did she obstruct justice in the investigation, the prosecution of this case? Well, maybe the database, the missing database, the database that was turned over without the code to the prosecution, maybe the government will argue that that was an obstruction of justice. If so, that's an additional 2. So we have 4 plus 2 plus 2 is 8. Additional 8 levels, okay? Now, if she's not considered a leader or an organizer, she could be considered a manager or a supervisor. So instead of 4 steps, she would get 3. So if you add that all up, she's looking at an additional 7 steps or 8 steps, depending on whether she's a leader or an organizer, or whether she's considered a manager or supervisor. And the reason I bring that up is because she was convicted on 1 count of conspiring to defraud investors, where Balwani was convicted of both of those conspiracy counts. 1, conspiring to defraud investors, and conspiring to defraud patients. So the judge, if the judge applies this factor, and again, this is just my estimate, my guess, my opinion, and again, this video is for information and educational purposes. So if the judge considers Elizabeth Holmes to be potentially more culpable, then maybe he applies 4-step increase if he considers organizing and if she's considered a leader. If not, maybe she's a manager or supervisor and gets a level 3. Okay, then I just want to preview. Those are the aggravating factors. Now, mitigating factors, and again, I just did a quick look again, and you could look at the video I did on 4 ways she could reduce her sentence. So the 3 mitigating factors that I think apply, and again, I'm sure the government and maybe the defense has different factors that they want the judge to consider. But in particular, did she accept responsibility? Did Balwani accept responsibility? I think the answer is no for both of them. Okay. So that doesn't give them a 2 or a 3-step reduction. Okay. The other thing, and here are a couple factors that the judge has discretion. It doesn't say in the sentencing guidelines how many steps to reduce. It leaves it up to the judge in their discretion to determine how many steps they would reduce the sentence. So one of the factors could be, did either one of them assist the prosecution? Well, I think for Balwani, that's a no. For Elizabeth Holmes, we don't know if she assisted in any way the prosecution of Sunny Balwani. We don't know. If she did, her attorneys, they could argue that her sentence could be further reduced. All right. What about coercion and duress? Was either one of these defendants under coercion or duress in their conspiracy or they're committing a wire fraud? Well, I think Elizabeth Holmes could argue that coercion and duress does apply, potentially, because of the abuse, the alleged abuse, and the alleged control that she claimed in her trial that Sunny Balwani had over her. Now, if that's true, and if the defense can convince the judge of that, that's potentially a factor to mitigate, to reduce. So the judge could reduce the potential sentence Elizabeth Holmes is looking at. All right, let's look at another factor. And I don't think duress or coercion at this point applies to Balwani because I didn't hear any of that. So here's the other factor that I think applies to both Balwani and to Holmes, and that is family ties and responsibility. So in other words, can Elizabeth Holmes or Sunny Balwani argue that, for instance, in Sunny Balwani's case, maybe he's financially responsible for his family, and that's irreplaceable. That's the test. Irreplaceable financial support for his family. Say, for instance, his mother. If he is the sole support, possibly that could convince a judge to give him a reduction in the sentence. Now, Elizabeth Holmes could argue that she has caretaking, and I guess Balwani could argue this too. He has a caretaking role and a financial role that's irreplaceable. She could argue that her being a new mom and potentially, I don't know, if there's another child on the way, she is of that age. If that applies, then maybe she could argue that she has a caretaking role that's irreplaceable or a financial role in her family that's irreplaceable. So I'm sure the government would probably argue, that they were taking care of the baby during the trial. So her role isn't irreplaceable. I don't know. We'll have to see what the government argues. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the sentencing table here, because I want to show you visually how to calculate this so you can calculate it for yourself as well. All right, so we started at level 7. This is a fraud case. So level 7 applies to both Sunny Balwani and to Elizabeth Holmes. So that's 0 to 6 months, assuming neither one of them have any criminal history, okay? So 0 to 6 months. Now, we have to also consider the amount of loss, and if you go ahead and take a look at the prior videos I did, both on the Balwani verdict and in calculating Elizabeth Holmes, you can take a look at the amount of loss is what exposes both Holmes and Balwani to significant prison time, okay? So, we're going to go down the chart here. So level 31. So Elizabeth Holmes was convicted of those 3 investor counts. If you add up the amount of money that the government alleges she defrauded and she was convicted of, that's approximately 144 million. So we add 24 steps to that level 7. So 7 plus 24 is level 31. So Elizabeth Holmes starts at 108 months to 135 months without looking at any factors in mitigation or in aggravation that I just talked about. Okay, but Sunny Balwani is already facing at least 27 months more because he starts at a level 33. And the reason he's at level 33 is because the amount of loss that he was convicted of defrauding, which was 155 million. Elizabeth Holmes, 144, Sunny Balwani, 155. But because he goes over that 150 million amount of loss, he gets an additional 2 steps, which adds up to 27 more months. So Balwani starts at level 33. Elizabeth Holmes starts at level 31. Okay. Then if we consider the worst case scenario, if we add all these factors in aggravation, Elizabeth Holmes was a leader and organizer, or Sunny Balwani was a leader and organizer, that adds 4 steps. If Elizabeth Holmes or Sunny Balwani did abuse of trust, taking investor money, holding that in trust, misusing it, spending it, committing fraud, that's an additional 2 steps. Okay. Then we have the obstruction of justice, right? If that missing database applies to either one of them, if either one of them are culpable, that's an additional 2 steps. Okay. So that means that we go from Elizabeth Holmes starting at level 31. She's looking at the worst case scenario, level 39. So that's 262 months to 327 months. So if I did my math right, I've got to look at my notes here. She's looking at 108 months to 327 months. So that's 9 to 27 years. Worst case scenario. Okay. That's before we apply that 30% averaging, 30% reduction that this judge seems to do in his prior sentencing on similar fraud cases, okay? So minimum, she's looking at 9 years before we apply that 30%, okay? Sunny Balwani is at level 33. Worst case scenario, adding all those factors in aggravation, he goes to level 41, which is 324 months to 405. So if I did my math right, that's 11 to 33 years, worst case scenario. But it's those factors in mitigation, right? If Elizabeth Holmes argues that coercion and duress, she could have asked the judge to give her less of a sentence, so to take her above 31, okay? Depending, and again, that's up to the judge's discretion whether or not he feels that coercion or duress, or that she has a family responsibility, whether it's financial or caretaking. She's a new mom. Maybe that the judge could do a downward reduction in the sentence, and maybe she goes up to level 30, 29, 28, 26, 25. I don't know. Okay? That's discretionary because the sentencing guidelines doesn't tell the judge that if they have an irreplaceable caretaking role or an irreplaceable financial responsibility for someone or their family, the sentencing guidelines doesn't say, that you reduce it by level 2 or reduce it by level 4. That's up to the judge. He has discretion on the sentencing, so, how much he feels it's appropriate. So, and again, this also applies to Sunny Balwani. He's at level 33. Maybe he gets a reduction too because of those mitigating factors. All right. We don't know yet. There's a lot of moving parts. We don't know what the recommendation is yet from the probation department. That should be coming in by September 12th. But I thought this might be interesting so you could take a look. Now, again, keep in mind that there's other information we may not know about yet. So, even though Elizabeth Holmes starts at level 31 before we apply aggravating factors or mitigating factors, and Sunny Balwani starts at level 33 before we apply aggravating and mitigating, maybe that takes them up the scale for a reduction, or maybe there's more aggravating and they end up going down to level 39 or 41. Okay, so I thought that would be interesting, that you might want to take a look at that. So if we do apply the 30% reduction average that this judge seems to have applied in his prior sentencing in fraud cases, that would be about 6.3 years for Elizabeth Holmes if she gets that minimum of 108 months at level 31, right? And Sunny Balwani, it would be about 8 years, starting at 135 months. That's level 33. Okay, that's before we add any factors to mitigate or to aggravate. Okay, so you see, I just kind of wanted to give you a ballpark of what the estimate could be, and for you also to do your own analysis looking at that chart as well. Okay, so let's see what else. So what do you think, the possible sentence could be? Do you think any of those aggravating factors apply? That missing database, what happened to that? Is that an obstruction of justice? Do you think Elizabeth Holmes or Sunny Balwani has a good argument to say that they're irreplaceable financial responsibility or caretaking roles such that their sentence should be mitigated, should be reduced? What do you think? What's your analysis? Okay, so big week coming up, because on Thursday, July 21st, Elizabeth Holmes has her hearing on a motion, I'll call it an acquittal motion. In other words, asking the judge to throw out the verdict, and potentially because there wasn't enough evidence to support that verdict. And if the judge throws it out, then all the sentencing is moot, clearly, right? But if the judge denies the motion, the acquittal motion, Elizabeth Holmes has the right to appeal. I'm sure Sunny Balwani is going to be filing a similar motion or motions. We'll find that out. And I'm sure both of them will be appealing their verdicts like every defendant has a right to do. Okay, so Thursday's Elizabeth Holmes' hearing on the acquittal motion. And by the way, Kristen Smart opening statements start on Monday. That's the case where the Cal Poly student, she was a Cal Poly student, age 19. No one has seen her for over 26 years. Last person I was with her was one of the defendants. He was walking her home from a off-campus party at Cal Poly. She's disappeared. Her body's never been found. It's going to be an interesting case, evidence-wise, I think. Cadaver dogs, radar search, radar ground, what do you call it? Ground sensor searching, to see what was dug up underneath the home of her Paul Flores' father's home, Ruben Flores, Paul was the last person seen with Kristen Smart. So evidence-wise, it's going to be a very interesting case. What evidence is going to come in, what the witnesses are going to testify to. It was 26 years ago. So no one has seen her. It's a tragedy. It's a terrible tragedy. Okay, so you let me know. Please do hit that like button. Please do leave a comment or question, and hit the bell notification. And please do subscribe. And if you want to support me making these videos, and again, thank you to all of those of you who have subscribed to this channel and helping me grow our community of analyzers. But if you want to support me making these videos, I appreciate it. And thank you to all of those of you who have contributed. I truly appreciate it. I'll put a PayPal link in the description box below the video. So, big week coming up. We'll see what happens on Elizabeth Holmes' acquittal motion. And we'll see what happens in sentencing coming up. So, thanks so much for watching. Hit that subscribe button and hit that like button.